Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Jones. I serve as the Associate Dean of Students and the Chief Diversity Officer here at Marietta College. And today, on the 16th of February, we are going to continue our celebration of Black History Month with a presentation by Dr. Alicestyne Turley. So when I think of Black History Month, I think of someone who knows the ins and outs of the Underground Railroad, someone who is an expert on Carter G. Woodson, someone who has spent her time and energy in research, and that would be Dr. Turley, who serves as the project director for Freedom Stories from the International Storytelling Center. She is a scholar, she's a historian, she's a native of Kentucky. If you want a question answered, please reach out to her. She can link it to Kentucky. She always has, she always will. And so the question today is, how much do you know about Marietta? And so she can allow you to ask questions in the chat box. If you have the option to use the reaction, raise your hand, we'll call on you. But without further ado, Dr. Alicestyne Turley, it's your stage.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be with you here at Marietta. It is such an important Ohio city. I know Cincinnati, when we talk about Underground Railroad, when we talk about reform, many times people are talking about Cincinnati and they forget about the little community of Marietta, which was really Ohio's first city. And it was Ohio's first city with the intent of changing how civil liberties, civil rights, all these things were shared. So today, I just wanted to spend some time talking about Ohio's first city as a place of reform for many of us that spread throughout the country. Ohio, the state itself, was a place of reform, but it all started right there in that little community of Marietta. So please feel free to think of your questions as we go along and to type them to me in chat box, and I'll try my best to answer. If I don't know, I'll be honest and tell you I don't know. So we think of Ohio as part of the Northwest Territory, of course, which was one of the first regions settled following America's Revolutionary War. It even had George Washington sailing along the Ohio River to come into the territory to claim land for himself. So one of the first people to arrive in Marietta on the Muskingum River looking for land and claiming land in Claremont County and other Ohio counties along the river was our first president, George Washington. And so this area was a huge area of which 5 states were developed all the way up to the Great Lakes regions. It was also, unfortunately for the Indians, an inhabited land that they lost when British and Americans, the colonists came over the mountains following the Revolutionary War. Actually, prior to the Revolutionary War, people were violating the Emancipation line or the Proclamation line to get into this new territory to claim land that really belonged to the Indians. So Ohio, this Northwest Territory at the end of the Revolutionary War, developed what we consider now the American system of organization. And by that, I mean that they developed this idea of shared lands. Prior to this, land was given by the fiefdom, by the king, and by the land grants that were given out to the nobles. And they made the decision as to who could own land in America. But once the Northwest Territory was settled, beginning in Ohio, beginning in this little community of Marietta, the land was held in fee simple, meaning anyone who had the money could purchase land. There was also a rule in this little community that if you purchased land and once the community was developed, there were some important things that needed to happen. Number one, people needed to have free access to education. And like everything else under British rule, education was something for the nobles. Nobles were the ones who were educated, usually in religious institutions, to go on to claim their birthright as leaders. But the everyday common man was given a trade or given some practical education that would allow them to gain some form of employment. But with the settlement of Ohio, Northwest Territory, and Marietta, the idea that education was a right that should be provided to all citizens. So there was also a prohibition against slavery. This idea of ending slavery, not letting it spread beyond where it was already located, Northwest Territory made that a founding part of its ordinance. So also they made a provision that universal education should be extended to the Cherokee Delaware, who were the largest Indian group still remaining in the territory along the Muskingum River. So from that land grant, they gave the Delaware, Cherokee Delaware, 10,000 acres. And even within those 10,000 acres, there was a school system set up for the Native Americans, for the Indians. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 became the first legislation in America for public education, making it a requirement that every town, every community that was established in the territory would be set up on a grid pattern. And within that grid pattern, every little community had to have land set aside for schools, because it was believed that religion, morality, was all based on knowledge. People had to be educated to be free. And so the ordinance divided the territory into 36-mile townships, and within every township, there was a plot set aside for schools. Among these reformers that came into the territory were people who believed that in addition to temperance, controlling alcohol, because alcohol was a tremendous detriment to families. Women were often left homeless because husbands would drink their income or gamble away their income, and families would then be destitute, and it created community problems. And so some of the reforms that America was working to implement in this new territory was temperance, education, no slavery, uh, the idea that children needed to be protected, women should have some protections under the law. And so the Muskingum River became a major byway for travel from the Ohio River into this region. And along with this travel came reformers from mainly New England, who traveled throughout Ohio, all the way down, of course, into Indiana and some of the other territories that had opened up, but mainly starting out in Ohio, little Marietta, right there in the river. The other benefit that Marietta had was it was right across the river from a slave-holding territory of Virginia. It was not West Virginia yet, it was still Virginia. And so right across the river from Marietta, as a watershed from the Appalachian Mountains into the Muskingum River, was one of the major Underground Railroad escape routes, because across that river in Virginia was some of America's growing industrial region. And as much as we talk about plantation slavery, we don't talk much about industrial slavery. So you had in West Virginia large numbers of industrial slaves working in the salt mines. You've heard that, that's where that term working in salt mines comes from, because West Virginia actually had salt mines, and coal and iron ore, which was all promoted and controlled by slave labor. So as the first permanent settlement in the Northwest Territory, founded by General Rufus Putnam, and you'll see that name again, if I'm thinking that name is probably still very prominent in the little community of Marietta, that the Northwest Territory set up shop as a riverboat town named after Antoinette, of the French queen, whose company, our country, provided a great deal of crucial financial aid to the American independence struggle. We sometimes forget France was one of the biggest financiers of the Revolutionary War. And so in honor of that, this is where Marietta received its name, from the Queen of France. And so Washington County was an influential part of American reforms, of course, slavery, anti-slavery, public education, temperance, and this idea of who could own land. So very early, this region had abolitionists who set up shop in Marietta. There's an 1819 poem I found written by James Lawton that hailed Marietta as one of the major places that slaves apparently knew about as an escape corridor long before many white Americans knew that slaves were escaping from West Virginia into Marietta and gaining their freedom there in Marietta. They either stayed in Marietta or moved further north to other locations. Some even went so far as Canada. But Marietta prided itself on being a place that protected escaping slaves from slave catchers, which often patrolled the streets of Marietta looking for escaped slaves. So it's important to get a vision of what America looked like during the 1860s as we're going into the Civil War. All those very dark shadows on your screen on this map are giving you an indication of where the majority of America's slaves were located. And you can see along that eastern seaboard corridor and western Tennessee going out into the western territories, and right there in West Virginia, right across the river in that little section where Ohio plays this key part in becoming an escape corridor. This is what America looked like in 1860. If you were trying to figure out where would you run to in America, if you were trying to gain your freedom, where could you go? So even though we think of the North as being a free territory, we should also keep in mind the North was not very happy about the idea of welcoming fugitive slaves. They were not, there was no welcome mat, basically, at the front door. Indiana, Illinois, even Ohio had strict Black codes where even if you were a free Black person in these places, you had so much time that you could stay in the state. Some states like Illinois and Indiana required if you were free, you had to post a bond for your freedom, even though you could prove your freedom. You had to have someone sign for you and a bond posted that said if anything were to happen, there were no expenses to these states. So many African Americans, rather than trying to escape north, and we always think about across the Ohio River as being north, but for many African Americans, real freedom didn't exist unless they reached Canada, or in some cases, Indian territories, which would have been out in Kansas, Nebraska, Utah. Those areas were still predominantly Native Americans, but Native Americans found out how profitable slavery was too. So for many of them, if there was a way to collect slaves like the Cherokee, who were some of the largest slaveholders in America, Native American slaveholders, they actually began to trade in slaves, capture slaves, and use them just as white Americans had used them. So staying in the United States did not automatically guarantee freedom. So in 1994, under the William Clinton administration, the National Park Service undertook what became a national park. It's a national park now, the Underground Railroad, to do a study, because up until 1994, the idea of an underground railroad was really a collection of stories from individual states who talked about this story and personalities and characters limited to their particular regions. And so the Park Service, with some pushing from African Americans who were begun to be employed by the Park Service under Robert Stanton, the first African American Park Service director, the Underground Railroad gained standing as a national story. And so the government actually invested money into doing a national study. A national, actually, it turned into an international study because it extended into Canada and Mexico, where they followed the tracks of the Liberty Line and made this what you hear about today, which is a National Underground Railroad story. And so some of their definition, National Park Service definition is the Underground Railroad is to assist persons held in bondage in North America to escape from slavery. Simple language. The height of its activity that was studied was primarily 1820 to 1865, but don't think of those dates as hard lines because actually there's recorded instances of slaves escaping from British control uh, in the 1600s. So we know that beginning with the first slaves who arrived in America up until the last state freed slaves, African Americans were escaping to various parts of America into maroon colonies, not only in the United States, but in Mexico and Canada. And we're just now, 2021, beginning to really explore these very early settlements that extended all the way down to South America. So the Underground Railroad is considered America's first interracial reform movement. It's considered America's first civil rights movement. NPS foundings, National Park Service findings said that there were actually 3 nationally identified escape corridors, which they defined as the Eastern Corridor, which was really a seaboard escape route using the coastline of the United States and the open Atlantic Ocean to gain freedom in Canada and in Cuba. The Central Corridor, which is where Marietta fits in because it became one of the major exit points from the Appalachian Mountain Trail, considered part of the Central Corridor into Canada, and the Western Corridor, which is Ohio, Mississippi, river escape routes. And these were primarily into Indian territories, the opening West, our uncharted West, and Mexico. The Underground Railroad system that people became familiar with and that Quakers really get a lot of credit for establishing, because even though Quakers, we think of them as the primary movers and shakers on the Underground Railroad, there's only a 10%, a very small percentage of the Quaker population who actually supported anti-slavery activity. And they were primarily Elias Hicks, who was an abolitionist leader out of New York and New Jersey, who broke away from the Friends group, basically, to say, the Quakers said, well, we're not as a denomination going to make a founding on anti-slavery. But if your conscience as a Quaker encourages you to be anti-slavery, we won't ban you, but that's an independent choice. So the independent Quakers that came about are the ones we really talk about when we speak of them as abolitionists. And this whole system of secrecy, agents and station masters and conductors are really a language that was developed by Quakers because Quakers, when they were under British rule, had their meetings had to be held in secrecy. So in order to hold their meetings, they developed a signage or coded language of speaking and presenting in order for them to host their Quaker meetings. And so this idea of a ticket agent, that is something that was developed by this coded language. And an agent is not necessarily someone who helps slaves escape. They just facilitate. Sort of think of them as being a station master or someone who hosts a place where you know where to get information to move on. And then you have, and that agent can travel. That agent can travel throughout various parts of the slaveholding country and tell you, give you information about how to get on the train. And then station masters are those who actually host the facility. If you are on the escape route, the station master is the one who would protect you until you moved on to the next location. And of course, conductors, who is quiet as it is kept, predominantly African Americans were the conductors, who actually, especially in a slaveholding South, African Americans were the conductors who allowed or aided people along the path to freedom. So the boarding call is if you didn't know the right language, if you didn't recognize the correct symbols, and if you didn't recognize the right music, you could miss the train. So the impetus for running away was often the fear of sale, especially as the United States began to develop. And because the British had closed the ports, we're not supposed to be bringing slaves in from Africa after 1808. But of course, the trade was continuing from Africa illegally. So the internal slave trade grew. And so slaves are beginning to be more mobile now. They're being moved about the country. And many times the South is divesting itself of slaves and they're selling them to a Southern culture who's clinging to slavery as an agricultural labor base. So fear of sale was often a reason for many people to run away. Sometimes separation of family. We talk a little bit later about Marietta, but one of the things that happens are folks moving from Western Virginia into Marietta are separating their families of slaves. Some slaves are in West Virginia, some slaves are going with families to Ohio, and many times people are trying to escape to find family. And the idea of keeping families together. Slaves run away in groups in an effort not to be sold away from each other, or the fear of death or severe punishment. I suppose if you know, if your slave owner has promised that if you run away one more time, he's either going to severely cripple or kill you, then there's really no incentive for you to stay. So many slaves, if they figured if they're going to die, why not die running? And of course, one of the most famous photographs that was taken is the picture of Gordon, who was a slave who escaped so many times, and he became Harper's Weekly. They took an image of him and how to demonstrate how many times he had been whipped for his attempts at freedom. We should also understand that most of the folks who owned slaves in America were extremely wealthy. There's this Thomas Jefferson advertising for a runaway slave, a mulatto named Sandy, who had run away, 35-year-old male. And of course, within these ads, when I work with students, these ads contain so much information that if you were to take the time to read them, you find out a great deal about what work these slaves were employed in, how much they were valued, what type of skills, even to the extent that they'd been punished, because it will often describe marks or whip or maimings that had been done to prevent these slaves from escaping. So these ads contain quite a bit of information, and just about every newspaper in America contain these ads. If anyone ever wanted to go through, sometimes there would be page after page after page of ads of runaway slaves and how much would be paid for their return. So it became quite a profitable business to be able to catch these slaves and return them. Modes of travel, we talk about an underground railroad and we use transportation terms, talking about trains, but really many of these escapes were not aboard any form of transportation. They're usually on foot. If you're lucky, you might have a horse. You might be able to catch a river boat and stay well enough hidden on that boat in order to land in a free territory. In Claremont, Ohio, a neighbor of Marietta along the river, there was an African-American man who had escaped from Kentucky who made a trade of making false bottom wagons in Claremont to be able to transport slaves to the interior counties of Ohio from various hotels that were located along the Ohio River. So these false bottom wagons actually became a production industry all on their own. There were some stagecoach drivers who would actually transport slaves aboard, and some of them would allow them to help them uh, with the teams or with luggage or to earn their passage to freedom without turning them in. And of course, we've all heard of Henry Box Brown, who shipped himself to Philadelphia. But there were others who also tried this, putting themselves aboard ships in order to be transported in boxes to freedom. Some of them not so fortunate to be able to get off intact or to get off and not be returned to slavery. So once the National Park Service did its study, this is basically the escape routes. This is what they looked like. And something we don't spend a lot of time researching, but should, are those routes. We talk a great deal about Canada, but also into the Caribbean and into Mexico. All those African American communities that developed on the other side of the river, a lot of them which still exist today in Mexico and along the Caribbean, Cuba. A lot of African Americans end up in Cuba during this time period. Where Marietta plays into the story is its close contact with the Appalachian Mountains and that Central National Park Service Central Underground Railroad escapes corridor to freedom, which basically utilized the Appalachian Mountain trails, which come from Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, into Nova Scotia, Canada. Literally, if you had the ability and the willingness to hike the Appalachian Trail from slavery to freedom into North America, New England, into Canada. And there were quite a few escaped slaves from Georgia who actually settled in Nova Scotia at the end of the Revolutionary War, who became a feeder for other African Americans trying to escape Southern slavery and finding themselves in Canada. That's a whole nother story. But along that Canadian border and Canadian trail become Montreal, all of those places where African Americans found freedom under the French flag and also under the British flag in Canada. So the Kanawha River Valley into Marietta, Ohio. This is not only a major Appalachian escape route, but it's also where major industries that employed the bodies of slaves for labor. This is why this area became so critical to Marietta, because it's across the river from major slaveholding. This little area, probably between North Carolina, West Virginia, Tennessee, you're mining ore, you're mining coal, you're mining salt, you have major forests. So all of these employ slave labor. In an 18 paper, we talk about people are actually exploring this history in Marietta. They want to document the reformers who are in Marietta, who talk about what they were doing in this little community during the time of slavery and all the many whites who were coming from New England, mainly Massachusetts and Connecticut, who are settling in the area to assist slaves. And so, again, they acknowledged that it was African Americans who informed them of their use of the Ohio River and Marietta and the Muskingum River to gain freedom in Marietta. And so they talk about Colonel Jack Stone, who was a man apparently very wealthy, who lived there in Marietta, who became one of the major funders of freeing slaves in the community. I don't know if that's a name that still resonates there in Marietta, but it would be nice to know more about him and his role in providing financial aid to escaping slaves. But Marietta had many, many people there in the community. So I thought we could take some time just to explore some of the personalities who made Marietta the base of their operation for this Underground Railroad reform movement. And not, keep in mind, even though we're talking about the Underground Railroad, it was really a religious movement that was concerned not only with freeing slaves, but also reforms of education, temperance, women's rights, children's rights. So there was a lot going on in addition to Underground Railroad escaping. Wilbur Siebert in 1889 published, he sent out a call to all, particularly in Ohio, Pennsylvania. He sent a call out to say, tell me the names of all of the people who were actively involved in the Underground Railroad. I'm trying to do a compendium so that this history is not lost. And so, based on all the records he collected, which are, by the way, and at Ohio University, at the Ohio Historical Society, now has all Siebert's papers. But from that, this Ohio Underground Railroad map was constructed. And right where you see this little red circle is Belpre and Marietta coming out of Parkersburg, Virginia, West Virginia, and this little quarter. Somewhere on here is Cincinnati. And if you notice, this is not, this is Claremont. So much of the escape that's happening, even though we credit up to Cincinnati, but that Appalachian escape corridor was probably one of the busiest corridors that extended all the way from the Ohio River into Canada. But Siebert is, of course, the one who lets us know the most about these early escape routes. And that information is there's still so much of it that needs to be mined. But Marietta took the initiative with the help of Henry Robert Burke to help us document what was happening. And this is a closer look at Belpre and Marietta and that little corridor of escape and how active it was in moving people from southeastern Ohio into the interior of the state on to Canada. And so from this early acknowledgement, not only because there was such a large Quaker population along this region, plus you had many congregational and Methodist leaders who were anti-slavery, and of course Harmar, which I guess now is considered as a suburb of Marietta, but that's kind of what Marietta was known as, Harmar, in the beginning, and apparently changed the name to Marietta. But some of the folks who would visit Marietta with this idea of understanding the spirit of reform that was alive and well in Marietta was a well-known abolitionist, Theodore Dwight Weld, who was the husband of Angela Grimke. So many people, if you don't know Theodore Dwight Weld, you know the name of Angela Grimke and her sister, Sarah Grimke, two of the best known female abolitionists in America. So he was considered very logical. He's a college professor, argued incessantly against this institution of slavery. He came into Ohio to begin Ohio's American Anti-Slavery Societies, beginning there in Marietta. And so one of the first anti-slavery societies was actually set up right there in Marietta. And he is, as a writer, editor, speaker, and organizer, he became well known around the country and in Europe. And so he became the co-author of the American book, American Slavery as It Is, A Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. And in this, he actually interviewed escaped slaves. He interviewed those who had worked on the Underground Railroad. And he found that he had a great deal of financial support right there in Marietta. So he was a frequent visitor and anti-slavery organizers. And from Marietta, he set up anti-slavery societies at Oberlin and Cincinnati and several other places throughout the state of Ohio. Again, using Marietta as a launch point. And it's so interesting to see him as a young man, as a fiery young man here in this first photo, and then to see him in his later years after slavery is over, but still very much committed to ideas of reform. Also, we tend to forget one of the better known, and I understand he has a TV show now called the something, Lord Bird, something. I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. Reverend John Brown, who was originally from Connecticut, but actually spent, his father had a iron shop there in Ohio, Hudson, Ohio. And so Reverend John Brown actually earned his stripes as an abolitionist. His father was an abolitionist as well, but he became one of the major conductors of that West Virginia he called it subterranean passageway. That was his term. And what you see him holding is his subterranean passageway flag. So anytime someone saw this flag, they knew that John Brown was in the Appalachian region and he was actually busy aiding slaves to escape from West Virginia and the Appalachian Trail. He would actually go himself, one of the very few white abolitionists who would actually go into slaveholding territory to help slaves escape. And as an agent, he used his home as a station, and he was a conductor. And I say he, but he was also aided by his wife and his second wife and his daughters in aiding slaves reach freedom in Ohio. Of course, he's also known for bleeding Kansas and a few other unorthodox means of granting freedom. Underground Railroad escape, abolitionism requires money. And so after John Brown is hung, we find out some of the men who were the financial supporters of his anti-slavery movement, many of them out of Massachusetts and maybe a couple out of Connecticut, but or New Hampshire. The Reverend Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and you might know him not only as a Unitarian minister, but also a person who wrote a great deal of anti-slavery music during this time period. Daniel Samuel Gridley, who was a very Gridley Howe, who was a very successful physician out of Boston, Massachusetts. Theodore Parker. This is one reason, by the way, Unitarians were not liked in America because they were very heavily reform minded and financed a great deal of anti-slavery Underground Railroad activity. So Theodore Parker was one of those men who was a funder. Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, you've heard of Sanborn maps. Okay, that is Sanborn here. That's the gentleman. He was a journalist and also a financier of Brown's activities. And Garrett Smith, a very wealthy landowner from Utica, New York, who financed much of, he really is considered the major financer of John Brown, including the raid on Harper's Ferry. And then Luther Stearns, an American industrialist from Medford, Mass. So these men provided a great deal of money to keep John Brown's operation going. And there was so much fear after John Brown was hung. All these men went about purging. It's the reason we don't know so much about them is because once John Brown was captured at Harper's Ferry by Robert E. Lee and the Marines, which Robert E. Lee organized to capture John Brown, that's another American story. The Marines come about mainly because they are to capture John Brown, and they capture him. Uh, but his son ends up in Ohio. Out, what is that island? It's an island. I'm so sorry, it blanks, but he escapes the Marines because he goes into this island. They can't get to him. But he alludes, John Brown, I didn't mean, I lost my train of thought because I got so caught up with this idea of Robert E. Lee and John Brown. But he's hung, and these men are so afraid that Robert E. Lee is going to come after them that they really begin to purge all of their communication that shows any relationship between them and John Brown. So it's only through scattered records we're able to find elements of the connection between these secret six, as they were known. But also part of this secret six, you would have had another subgroup of African American leaders, which included Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Lewis Hayden, a whole group of Massachusetts anti-slavery Black leaders who actually advised Brown not to do the raid on Harper's Ferry. But of course, they were not listened to, and we know the results. A major Quaker who used Marietta and also helped to organize anti-slavery Quakers in the Appalachian region was Ohioan Benjamin Lundy. Benjamin Lundy, young man, grew up hating slavery. He became an agent where he actually would travel all the way down to East Tennessee. He worked with the Quakers in East Tennessee, Jonesboro, Johnson City, to share information about the best escape routes to take out of slavery into freedom in Ohio, Marietta, and Mount Pleasant primarily. He was a writer, a journalist. He published Ohio's first anti-slavery newspaper, and he came out of Wheeling, Virginia, which was he. This is where his family's from. That's where he was born. So he was intimately familiar with the idea of slavery, and as a result, became a station master in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, initially, but was not happy with simply being a station master. He went on to help Weld and others organize Ohio anti-slavery societies, as well as establish anti-slavery societies all the way from Southern Ohio into Missouri, Ohio, Tennessee. He worked with East Tennessee Quakers Elihu and Thomas Embry, and other there were like 400, and he established at least 400 anti-slavery societies in East Tennessee and Central Tennessee, and including working with Elias Hicks in New York. So these again, and it's, I hate, this is an image that was taken, I pulled it offline, of what his house looks like today. I see the marker, the Ohio marker out front, but I would also hope at some point in the future, Ohio can find some funds to possibly restore this very important station. James Davis, he's considered the first free Black man born in Marietta in the Northwest Territory, but he was born there in Marietta. And he was a violinist, a barber, and also first president of the American Sons of Protection, which was a group organized to protect escaped slaves who had made their way to freedom in Ohio. He eventually settled in Dayton, Ohio, and continued his work as a Methodist anti-slavery advocate up until his death, which was 1862, about the time the Civil War is really being promoted. Unfortunately, I have no images of him. He was considered a free man in Ohio, was not enslaved, but remained an active Underground Railroad conductor. Frances Dana Barker Gage, obviously a woman of her, ahead of her time, Marietta, Ohio resident. This is her home down in the corner, she and her husband. But she was a writer and actually was became involved in anti-slavery politics because she saw the possibility that women could gain their freedom as well if by assisting slaves in gaining their freedom. So she became a very active leader of Marietta's women's rights movement. Again, another one of those movements launched right out of that little community. She was a lifelong friend of Clara Barton, worked with Clara Barton as a nurse during the Civil War in the Western Sanitary District, which raised money to care for Union soldiers. She was a friend to Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In fact, sources state that it was Barker who actually published uh, Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech, which was delivered at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. So she, as an employee of the Western Sanitary District, she also established many hospitals to care for uh, wounded soldiers. She did letter writing for the troops. She worked with fundraising for hospitals to aid them, and I'm hoping her home. I don't see a marker there in Ohio, but hopefully that is one of those homes that's being taken care of there in Ohio's historic district. Another important Marietta anti-slavery advocate, of course, is the Putnam name you saw earlier as one of the founders or a founder of Marietta, David Putnam Jr., who was a cousin to the brigadier general who founded the community. And I know his house is long gone. He had a couple of homes there in Marietta, but I understand that both of them are no longer there. He's probably best known more for his legal cases that happened in defense of anti-slavery, where he was actually charged by slave owners from West Virginia for aiding slave escapes. So the one case he gets charged for is when he helped 9 slaves valued at over $5,500 escape to Marietta and disappear. They were never captured. And so he was represented by Salmon P. Chase, who at this time, again, another Ohio native, who goes on to become a Supreme Court justice under Abraham Lincoln. But he had a reputation for defending these high profile uh, abolitionist cases where abolitionists are captured or charged with these a federal offense in aiding slave escape. And so he won his case, uh, or Chase won the case for him, but he worked as an Underground Railroad conductor until the end of the Civil War, and then became very active in Marietta in helping establish schools to educate the newly freed slaves. And last but not least is Charlotte Scott, who is also from Marietta. Now, if you don't know Margaret or Charlotte Scott, you will, because right now there's a controversy brewing over something that she helped establish, which I would love to hear people's comments on as we close this presentation. But Charlotte Scott was owned by Meg Scott, who from Covington, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. She was given to Meg by Meg's parents as a wedding gift when she married Dr. William Rucker. And as a physician, Rucker moved from slaveholding West Virginia into Marietta, Ohio, where he established his practice. And then Charlotte became part of, when he received Charlotte as part of his household, he immediately gave Charlotte her freedom. And so when Charlotte came to join Meg in Marietta, she became a free woman. And she made her living there in Marietta, still working for the Rucker family, but also as an independent washwoman and craftswoman there in Marietta. So when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, she was so moved by his loss and his assassination that she went to, I would suspect, Barker Gage, and who was working with the Sanitary Commission there in Marietta, and raised the first money. She wanted a monument to Abraham Lincoln. And so with her initial funding, she gave the initial money and helped to collect funds from the African American troops and other African Americans in her community to raise a monument to Abraham Lincoln on behalf of the formerly enslaved. And she was so successful at it that they raised enough money to have this monument erected. It is the first fully paid for monument by African Americans in America. And you may not know, but this is the monument called Freedom's Memorial. It sits in Washington, D.C. on Constitution, Kentucky Avenue. And it is currently one of those monuments, you know, with everyone removing now what's considered to be monuments from the Civil War. This is one of those monuments that people are pushing to have removed from the mall. And I'm not one who thinks this is a monument that needs to go. I think sometimes if we don't know the history of something, it's very easy for us to just say, well, get rid of it. But I am curious to I'd love to open this up for discussion to find out how people feel about this monument. So the criticism of the monument is that Archer Alexander, who is the slave who you see kneeling, he's an actual person. He's considered the last slave captured under the Fugitive Slave Law. He was captured in Missouri. He was asked to pose for this monument, and he did so. The criticism of the monument, of course, is that it shows Lincoln and it shows Archer on his knees, and most people are not happy with that. And what Lincoln has in his hand, of course, is the Emancipation Proclamation, which he is now offering to Archer. And as Archer is rising, his chains are broken, he's rising to his feet. But people have a real objection to the fact that he's under Lincoln's hand. And they feel that it makes him appear subservient to Lincoln. So this is my last slide, but I would like to hear how others feel about this. So I guess, Ms. Monica, this is where we can
So here's the time for folks to ask their questions, but more importantly, she's asking you to provide your insight on the actual memorial. So who would like to share some thoughts? And I can't imagine this is a quiet group, so.
Don't be shy. There's no such thing as a bad question.
Exactly.
How many have ever seen this monument?
I was with you.
Right. I know. How many folks are, I think that's part of the problem. If you don't know the history of the monument, and certainly if you don't know the Marietta, Ohio connection to the monument, how do you feel? Do you feel somehow it is offensive?
Hi, Dr. Turley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Joellen Yeary, and I want to thank you for this presentation. I unfortunately had to take a phone call because I actually got my call to come in for my vaccination, so I didn't get to hear everything. But in answer to your question about the monument, I totally agree with you. You have to know the history of the piece, and I understand the idea that the gentleman is kneeling and beneath Abraham Lincoln here, but the fact that it was paid for by African Americans speaks volumes to me. They commissioned it, I assume, and approved of this sculpture the way it was. So if you go back to the time that they raised the money, they approved this form of art, then I think we need to keep it.
That was actually going to be my question. While they funded it, did they actually have a say in what it looked like? Because I think what's really unfortunate is we're looking at it straight on. But my guess is from the ground, you're quite far, right? You're looking up. And I think that the scroll can be lost from the ground. And if the scroll had actually been prominent, then you might, even if you don't know, you might say, oh, Emancipation Proclamation, maybe that's what this is. But I am curious about who actually designed it, and did the funders actually get to approve it?
And thank you so much, Christy, because that is part of the issue, is that of course there was only one African-American sculptor during this time, Edmonia Lewis. I don't know, again, another Ohioan from Oberlin, Ohio, but African-American female sculptor. Her work now, if anybody should come across it, you are a very wealthy person. So hold on to it. But the artist who actually crafted it was in Italy. They actually found an Italian statue maker, or however the proper term would be, who designed it. But I am almost positive African Americans probably had very limited say in how this eventual monument ended up looking. And keeping in mind that it was supposed to be a tribute to Abraham Lincoln. That was Charlotte Scott's desire. It was all about honoring the fact that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation and lost his life for doing it. So again, this would be a European interpretation, an emphasis more on Lincoln than necessarily Archer Alexander. And that is probably part of the issue. But even though I can understand why people are feeling that way, I find it very difficult to destroy something that, think of Charlotte Scott. I mean, it's not like she had bags of money. I mean, you're literally talking to people who have just gotten out of slavery, who are donating. They donated $16,600, which if you break that down into today's currency, that's almost $500,000 in order to have this monument constructed. And so the mere fact that African Americans throughout the country did this, and by the way, the majority of the contributors to the monument were African American troops who had been, their idea was they wanted the monument to also represent the loss of Black life that fought, because the emancipation not only freed the slaves, it allowed African American men to enlist in the military. So it was the first time they had been officially recognized by the federal government as fighting men. So they were the major contributors to the funding of the monument. So there's a lot tied up in this little monument, even though people are looking at it from a modern day perspective, and that fact that Archer Alexander is on his knees and all of that. It is just so hard for me to sacrifice, to know what they did to create it, and that it is the first monument in America paid for totally by African Americans. I don't think you can dismiss it as easily. But I understand my thinking. I'm biased. I'm definitely biased.
Is there any move to have the image posted in the African American Museum in the Smithsonian to garner discussion over it, so that anyone who goes to the museum could then see that the monument was funded by former slaves? Is the question to remove it and destroy it, or to relocate it? It's not to be on the prominence of the mall, or is there an opportunity to move it somewhere where it could garner more educational background?
I think because people are not familiar with the history of it, and I've written a couple articles that have appeared in national newspapers giving the history of it, and trying to encourage people to think about the memorial differently. The younger generation of historians coming along want it gone. They hate it. So they're just saying, just make it go away. I don't know if anyone has actually said, okay, if you destroy it, or are you destroying it, or are you moving it? That might be. But then if you move it, I feel like African Americans are giving up valuable real estate. I mean, what do you replace it with? Where do you put in its place? I mean, I don't know how this monument is explained, or even if it is explained, when people are doing city tours of Washington, D.C. The fact that it's at Kentucky and Constitution is in itself significant. It's meant to represent the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a Kentuckian. Archer Alexander was an escaped Kentucky slave. I mean, it has a great deal of symbolism. So how do you interpret that symbolism? What do you replace it with? If you commission a new work, what would that new work be? So I don't know if moving it into a building, is that really the best? I don't know. I can't see putting it inside the museum. To me, that would almost be a symbol that we've overcome, and now it is simply an object for a museum, when in actuality, this idea of fight for freedom is still going on.
And so, Dr. Turley, not that this is on the same note, but it's related. So what are your feelings about the Edmund Pettus Bridge? I mean, you know, they're trying to change that name. And so how do we acknowledge the history when people are trying to change these significant incidents that happened in our history?
Thank goodness they have decided to keep the bridge name the same. Again, I was not a person who supported changing the name of the bridge. Why? To me, that I can see why the family, which by the way was the biggest proponent against changing the name, because they don't want to have this stuck to their family legacy over time. I get it. But unfortunately, we all have to live with choices that are made. So I don't think calling the bridge Freedom's Bridge or whatever name they were, why? That is not the actual. Edmund Pettus was a proud Ku Klux Klan member. I think we should honor that and just keep the bridge so that people are aware of the history as it was, not how we would like it to be, but what actually happened, which was that people died on that bridge, people were beaten on that bridge. It was a dividing line between freedom and the right to vote in Montgomery or staying enslaved on the cotton plantations of Selma. That bridge received a lot of blood from people. I don't think you necessarily erase the history of it by changing the name. I just don't see the need. I think.
And so on that argument, I'd say that the Freedom Memorial should probably it should stay, and we should focus on the history and the connection as opposed to those who find it offensive based on the image alone. I guess I would, want it to stay.
But how much of this do you believe is because of the way we teach history? If African Americans only see themselves as Archer on his knees, which by the way, Archer is rising from his knees to his feet. But of course, you have to see him that way and not already have it in your mind. We have to acknowledge African Americans were enslaved in America. There's no amount of rewriting of history that's going to change that fact.
But in America, we try real hard to talk about slavery, but never talk about enslaved Africans. So again, that's our bias. We don't like the word slavery. We don't like slaves. So slavery without slaves is like racist without racism. So I don't know.
Right. It existed. I do try to use the term enslaved because we were enslaved. We did not come out of our mother's womb as slaves, but we were enslaved. So I get that. That's proper language. But the history remains that this country was built on the backs of slaves, period. So I think a better telling of the story would be great.
Oh, I appreciate you taking the time to tell us this part of our own history that we probably didn't know here in Marietta. And then more importantly, I want to thank those who took the time to jump in over their noon hour. I hope you enjoyed your lunch as well as great conversation. And we have hit the 1 o'clock hour. So I want to thank Dr. Turley and our guests who have Zoomed on with us. And again, if you have questions or concerns, please reach out. She is a wealth of knowledge, not just about her own history, but everybody else's. That's what she does. She studies history, all kinds of history. So again, thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon. Greatly appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turley.
Thank you, Tony. Bye-bye.
How you doing, Dr. Valerie? You are muted, love. Unmute yourself, Dr. Valerie. There you go. There you go.
Figuring this stuff out, it changes every time. But I'm well.
You look really nice.
It's very cold. You know, I was showing my gray, but I couldn't, it overwhelmed me. It was so much gray.
Stop. Look at all this in the front of my head.
I had to put some color back up there. So I'm happy. It's much better. So this was really good. I'm really sorry more people didn't sign up because this was so informative.